this video, I'm going to talk about credible sources. What you'll need before we get going is the 4 sources that you did for homework, the research that you did, and the descriptions that you wrote up, because at a certain point I'm going to ask you to pause the video and do a little exercise with those. In addition to that, you might want your textbook, just because I'm going to make reference to it, and so if you want to follow along with the part that I'm discussing, you might want to grab that, and of course something to take notes with. So, the definitions essay assignment asks you to make use of 2 credible outside sources to back up your own argument. As I already said, for homework, you were required to find 4 credible sources just to get yourself going on your research, and then you can decide whether you only want to use 2 of them, if you want to use all 4 of them, if you want to find totally different sources because those 4 aren't going to work for you. Whatever you want to do is fine, but you will ultimately need 2 credible, relevant sources to support your argument. So what I want to start by talking about is, first of all, how do we define a credible source? What does credible even mean to us? You're probably most likely to think of the word credible as meaning trustworthy, and that's a great definition. That's essentially what we're looking for, is a trustworthy source. A piece of research where you can look at it and you can say, I believe what the author is saying to me. I think that they're, if not correct, what they're saying is at least valid and it's a worthy argument to be made. Now, the good news is that as grown-ups who have been in school for at least a little while, you all probably have a decent sense, just by looking at a piece of writing, of whether or not you trust it. What we want to sort out now are your reasons for trusting something. Why have you chosen to trust one piece of writing, whereas you might disregard the words of another writer? There's a few things to keep in mind. Your book, I'm looking at Chapter 18, Evaluating Sources, page 412, gives a pretty long list of ways to assess print sources. Among them, relevance, credentials of the author, stance of the author, credentials of the publisher or sponsor, stance of the publisher or sponsor, currency, accuracy, level of specialization, audience, length, availability, and omissions. You guys read this for homework, so I won't go back over it. What I want to talk about are a few key things, some of which is addressed here, that I think of as being the big buttons for credibility. So, first of all, I said, simply if you instinctively trust the author, that's a good start. Another big thing to consider when we're talking about credibility is, does the author's argument come with supporting evidence? Are they telling you why they believe what they believe in a way that's supported and validated by either statistics, facts, their own research, the research of others, reference to other sources? How are they supporting their evidence? If they are supporting their evidence, that's a good start. If they provide no support for what they're saying, it's time to be skeptical. But here's where things get tricky, because oftentimes well-regarded authors who are very credible will write opinion pieces where they might not make reference to specific outside sources. So that can't tell you everything you need to know. So where else can we look? Well, the source itself, where it comes from, is another big hint for us. What type of source is it? Is it a book? Is it a newspaper article? Is it a blog? Is it something somebody just wrote on Twitter? Where did it come from tells us a lot. And I think that students get worried about the distinction between online sources and print sources. You guys seem to believe that I believe that print sources are inherently more credible than online sources. And this isn't true. Books and newspaper articles and magazine articles demand the same amount of scrutiny as online sources. Now, that said, there's a lot more junk on the internet than there is in print. It's a lot easier to find junk on the internet that you don't want to have anything to do with than it is to find it in books. But that doesn't mean there isn't just as much credible material on the internet. And your book talks about this a little bit. With print sources, we want to look to who's the publisher. Is the book published by a university press, a well-known press, or is it some independent publisher that nobody's ever heard of? Simply looking at the cover and quality of a book can tell you a lot about it. If it looks like it's a real book, that's way better than if it looks like it's a pamphlet that somebody stapled together. Because then we know that it's gone through some sort of editing and oversight process. Somebody else had to look at it and say, this information is worthwhile. Same thing with magazines and newspapers. If it's a name that you've heard of, that you know has some clout to it, essentially, like the New York Times or CNN, that's going to be a lot better off for you than a magazine that you've never even heard of. Or something that sounds like it's going to be very niche and specified and appealing only to, maybe a fringe audience or something. So that's another thing to keep in mind. A familiar name is probably a safer name. With regard to online resources, there's nothing wrong with starting a search by just typing something into Google. That's not a bad thing to do at all. Students think, oh, I'm supposed to go to the library, my instructor wants me to go to the library, I'm doing something wrong by using Google. You're not. But you do have to be discriminating, because Google is going to bring up all kinds of stuff, and a lot of it isn't going to be the best, but some of it is going to be good. Some of it is going to be, newspaper articles, magazine articles, and scholarly articles that simply happen to exist online instead of just in print. That stuff's great. Where you want to be careful, again, are things where if it doesn't look like somebody's maybe put a lot of time into it, or there's been any sort of oversight or editing, that's a good indication you're going to be in trouble. If there's no author, you should be skeptical. Articles or blogs that don't name an author or that use a clear synonym, if nobody's taking credit for that work, it means nobody's proud of that work. Nobody wants their name attached to it. That's an indication that it's probably not credible. Similarly, information from organization websites can be very useful, but written with a particular kind of bias. We'll come back to bias in a minute. So, that's a lot of very vague information. I'm saying, well, look at the quality of the text, look at, make sure there's an author, look at who published it, and you're like, well, I still don't always know how to tell. So let me make it a little bit simpler, and I'll just give you straight up some examples of things that we can generally trust as credible and some things that we can generally dismiss as not credible. This isn't 100% across the board, but it's a good rule of thumb. So, things that we generally can trust as credible. Books that you can find in our college's library are generally going to be credible. Scholarly articles that you can find through the college's databases will always be credible. Newspaper and magazine articles published by what I'll call name brand publications, known publications, we'll call those credible. Anything that's a website, but it has a .edu, a .org, something along those lines where you know who's writing it, we'll call that credible. Things that we know aren't credible. Social media, you guys know that. You can't just trust something that somebody posted on Facebook. You got to go look at it yourself, check it out. Blogs, as a general rule. Now, some blogs are written by experts in the field, and they're very professional, and they're going to be very credible, but some blogs are, just people ranting about their opinions about gun control and cats and some good soup recipes all together, and so we kind of want to be very, very careful with blogs. Other things that we know are not credible. Again, publications that you know, like in your brain, shouldn't be trusted, like the National Enquirer. There are some things where you're like, I know that name and I know it's not a real thing. The Onion, not real news, uh, not a credible source. So those are a few just like big categories of things like we can trust this, we cannot trust this. Wikipedia, not credible. Not because it's not good information. Sometimes it can be really helpful to look at Wikipedia just to get a sense of something. But because anybody can edit Wikipedia pages, you can't really trust that because again, there's no author, there's no real substantial oversight. So we can't use Wikipedia. So keeping those ideas in mind, as well as what's available to you in the book on pages 412 through 414, what I'd like you to do is review your own four sources. Sources. And below where they're written on your piece of paper, rank them in order of credibility. So number 1 is the one you think is most credible, down to number 4, and then write for yourself a brief explanation of why you think one is more credible than the other. So go ahead and pause this video for a few minutes and do that, and then pick back up with me in a minute. Okay, so now that you've done that, I want to move on.